Hello and welcome back to Thecrimereel. Today we will be looking at the crimes of Florence Ransom, a young woman from Kent in England who managed to shock those around her with her heartless crime at a time when the country was already at war. The story is now going to continue with the brilliant YouTuber Briefcase. Over to you.
Florence Ransom was born in Preston, Lancashire in 1904. She was known to be a confident and high-spirited girl. Her father was a portrait painter by the name of Frederick Guilford, but when Florence was young, her family broke up, and at this point details of her childhood became particularly vague. According to her own accounts, she travelled wildly throughout her youth, but details of these travels were always ambiguous. She liked to be thought of as a mystery woman, with different versions of her past being told to different people. Some were told that the person she called Mother had purely been hired to care for her, whilst others believed that she was part of the British aristocracy and that her real name was Lady Iris Cornwallis West. When Florence was 21, she married a bookseller by the name of Douglas Ransom. Sadly, Douglas died just a few years later. Finding herself alone at 24, Florence became a social climber, determined to improve her lifestyle. When Florence was introduced to Lawrence Fisher, he was mesmerised by her, and they soon embarked upon a relationship, despite their 20-year age gap. His marriage to his wife, Dorothy Fisher, had broken down several years before. Lawrence and Dorothy had two daughters, Joan and Frida, and remained amicably separated, while still living together in their West London home. Dorothy had a lover of her own, and both Florence and Dorothy's lover were frequent visitors at the family home. This arrangement, despite being unconventional, particularly in 1930s Britain, seemed to work well for all the people involved. However, in 1938, Lawrence Fisher decided to buy Carramore Farm in Piddington, Oxfordshire, and moved there with Florence Ransom. At this point, Florence started masquerading as Mrs. Fisher, and those around her assumed she was Lawrence's wife, not just his mistress. She maintained an air of mystery to the local people, and often felt that it was beneath her to enter into a conversation or even to provide a basic greeting. On the few occasions when she did engage in conversation, she tended to ramble at length, without direction, often contradicting herself. She always mentioned her extensive travels, but was ambiguous on the details. People generally regarded her as a strong, beautiful, but unusual woman. The staff at the farm found her difficult to work for. Her temper was often uncontrollable. She was known to have fits of rage and fire the entire staff before reinstating them when she had finally calmed down. Before long, she hired both a maid and a cowman, who, unbeknown to Lawrence, were actually her mother and her brother. In March 1940, 2 years after Lawrence and Florence had moved to Oxfordshire, Lawrence's wife Dorothy Fisher decided to move permanently to the village of Matfield in the Kent countryside. The Fishers already owned a 2-bedroom cottage there, which had been used as a weekend retreat prior to the war starting. Their eldest daughter Joan had sailed to India a couple of years prior to marry a doctor, so Dorothy, along with her younger daughter Frida and their maid, named Charlotte Saunders, made the move from West London to Kent. At this point, the domestic arrangements between those involved appeared to be civilised, but under the surface cracks were starting to form. With increasing tensions arising from the Second World War, Lawrence frequently travelled to Matfield to check on his wife and his daughter. It is believed that Lawrence also gave them money, which made Florence extremely jealous. Further problems arose because Florence was desperate to marry Lawrence and officially take the title of Mrs. Fisher, but Dorothy was refusing to give Lawrence a divorce. Before long, Florence had devised a plan to resolve her problems. On the 3rd of July 1940, Florence visited an ironmonger's in Oxford and bought 25 .410 cartridges. She then asked her brother who was working at the farm to teach her how to shoot. Florence told him that she wanted to go out shooting rabbits, and so he happily obliged. Just under a week later, on Tuesday the 9th of July 1940, Florence boarded the 8:56 a.m. train from Bicester, Oxfordshire, and started the long journey to Kent. She was carrying a brown package containing the .410 shotgun. Sometime later that morning, Florence arrived at Dorothy and Frida's home. At least superficially, she remained on good terms with the women, and they would have welcomed her in. Florence and Frida then went out into the orchard on the pretense of shooting rabbits, but almost immediately, Florence raised the shotgun and shot 20-year-old Frida in the back. Frida was critically injured, but still alive, at which point Florence turned her attention to Dorothy. Dorothy had witnessed the shooting of her daughter and attempted to run away. Florence chased her and shot her twice in the back, killing her immediately. Once satisfied that Dorothy was dead, she returned to Frida, who lay dying on the ground, and shot her twice more. Florence then returned to the house, where the maid, Charlotte Saunders, was preparing tea for the women. Charlotte dropped a tray and ran for her life, but was pursued by Florence, who shot her at close range, killing her instantly. In total, Florence fired 6 shots, but with the imminent German invasion, Kent was full of soldiers in training, and as such, this noise would have drawn little attention. Florence then travelled back to her farm in Oxfordshire. Lawrence had already arrived home from work when Florence returned, an unusual occurrence, as they always dined together during the early evening. Florence was agitated and distressed, and informed Lawrence that she had seen a lost cat, and when chasing it, she had fallen down and hurt herself. Throughout the night she was restless and distressed, and would not settle, but at that point, Lawrence had no reason to question her account of the day. Meanwhile, in another house in the village of Matfield, Dorothy's mother, Mrs. Gibbs, was waiting for her daughter to arrive. Mrs. Gibbs was in her 80s and enjoyed Tuesday afternoon tea with her daughter Dorothy every week. At 5 p.m, Mrs. Gibbs began to worry. Her daughter was extremely late, which was completely out of character for her. Mrs. Gibbs phoned Dorothy's home several times, but she got no reply. At approximately 6:30 that evening, Mrs. Gibbs asked her gardener, John Lurie, to go and check on her daughter. John Lurie arrived at Dorothy's home at around 6:45 p.m. on the 9th of July. He entered the garden through the front gate and immediately saw a woman's body lying in front of the house, just off the long path leading to the front door. John immediately ran to call the local police, who soon arrived at the scene. They inspected the body, now known to be Charlotte Saunders, and also the cottage. The doors were open. There was a mess from the smashed remains of the tea that Charlotte had been preparing, and it appeared that there had been a burglary. Further police assistance was requested, but as the evening drew in, the examination of the bodies and the investigation of the scene were severely hampered by investigating officers having to work by torchlight due to the blackout enforced during World War II. Initially, they believed that Charlotte had died from severe head injuries, although it later transpired that these devastating injuries had been caused by a shot in the back of the head. Investigations of their home contradicted the initial theory of a burglary gone wrong, as although in a mess, it appeared that nothing of any value had been taken from the cottage. The police then proceeded to search the outhouses, land and orchards surrounding the cottage. As they approached a small path leading through the undergrowth to the orchard, they came across the lifeless body of Frida. At the other end of the orchard, they found Dorothy's body. Approximately halfway between Dorothy and Frida's bodies, they found a white left-handed lady's glove. Although initially unclear as to whether this bore any relevance to the case, it later became a crucial part of the evidence. Mrs. Fisher's lover was immediately considered to be a suspect, but was soon ruled out, as his whereabouts that day would have made it impossible for him to have returned to Kent. The following morning, the 10th of July 1940, Lawrence Fisher was stopped by police during his morning commute and asked to return to his farm. It was there that he was informed of the murder of his wife and daughter by DCI Beveridge, the man in charge of the police investigation. DCI Beveridge took the opportunity to examine the farmhouse, and it was at this point he met Florence for the first time. She was resting in one of the pair of beds in the master bedroom. Leaving Florence to get dressed for the day, the inspector went outside and spoke to the foreman of the farm. The foreman informed him that Florence was Mrs. Fisher, a fact that immediately rang alarm bells in view of the fact that the inspector had just broken the news of Mrs. Fisher's death to her husband. The foreman went on to say that Mrs. Fisher was extremely dictatorial and difficult to work for, and also mentioned that she had recently been having shooting lessons with the cowman named Fred. Upon returning to the house, Florence was now officially introduced to Inspector Beveridge. At this point, he found out that this Mrs. Fisher was actually Florence Ransom, and noted that whilst beautiful, she appeared distant and vacant. Lawrence was then driven by police to Kent for the heartbreaking job of identifying his wife and his daughter. Inspector Beveridge later returned to the farm and interviewed Florence with regards to her whereabouts on the 9th of July. She was vague and imprecise, but maintained she had not left the farm all day. Both Mary and Fred Guilford, Florence's mother and brother, who were secretly employed at the farm, confirmed her presence at the farm on that Tuesday, although the exact details were ambiguous and inconsistent. Inspector Beveridge soon discovered the family connection between Florence, Mary and Fred, something that came as a complete shock to Lawrence. Lawrence had no idea that Florence's mother and brother were working at the farm, having always believed Florence's mysterious stories of links to a titled family. With his suspicions heightened, the inspector produced the glove that had been discovered in the orchard. He asked Florence to try it on, which she replied that she would, but it looked as though it would be too small. When the glove fit her perfectly, she returned it to the inspector, seemingly unconcerned. Further investigations led to several witnesses coming forward who had seen Florence during her journey to the farm to Mapfield that day. She had made no attempt to disguise herself and was consistently described as agitated, confused, and at times incoherent. On Friday the 12th of July, 1940, Florence Ransom was arrested for the murder of Dorothy Fisher, Frida Fisher, and Charlotte Saunders. Florence went on trial in November 1940, where she maintained that the entire day was a complete blank, and she had no recollection of the 9th of July. She seemed unaffected by the prolonged cross-examination she was subjected to. Once all the evidence was presented and the arguments made, the jury took just 47 minutes to return a verdict of guilty. Florence immediately cried out that she was innocent and collapsed as the death sentence was pronounced. Despite its shocking and violent nature, the crime and trial received little newspaper coverage at the time due to the extreme events of the Battle of Britain and the Blitz. Sometime later, an appeal was raised on the basis that Florence's mental health had not been taken into account at the original trial. At this appeal, Florence could barely pronounce her own name and was incoherent, swaying about in the dock and muttering to herself. It then came to light that Florence did in fact have a long history of mental instability and had been a voluntary patient on a number of previous occasions. As a result of the evidence in regards to her mental well-being, she was pronounced insane. The death penalty was revoked, and she spent her final days as a patient at Broadmoor High Security Psychiatric Hospital in Berkshire, England. I'd like to thank the amazing channel, Thecrimereel, for giving me the opportunity to narrate on his channel. My channel is called Briefcase, and I mainly narrate historical crime stories. So if you'd like to visit my channel, please click on the link below. And Thecrimereel will be back next week.
Well, I hope you found that story interesting. Thank you so much to Briefcase for narrating that story for me. Please go and check out Briefcase's channel. Thank you once again for visiting the Crime Reel. Goodbye.